Greetings and welcome to our celebration and observance of the 100th year anniversary of women's suffrage here at San Jacinto College North Campus. Today's virtual event is titled Women in Politics. The purpose for this event is to discuss the impact women have had on politics, how public policy has been shaped by women, and the future of women in politics. I am honored to introduce our distinguished panel. We are joined today by U.S. Representative Sylvia Garcia. Representative Garcia has an extensive and very impressive history of public service. So in the interest of time for our audience, here are some of the highlights. In 1998, she was elected city controller, the second highest elected official in Houston city government, and its chief financial officer. Sylvia was sworn into the Texas Senate on March 11, 2013, representing Senate District 6. And on January 3rd, 2019, she was sworn in to represent Texas Congressional District 29. She became the first Hispanic member of the Houston Congressional Delegation and one of the first two Latinas to represent the state of Texas in the U.S. Congress. Representative Garcia, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Additionally, we are also joined by Dr. Cammy Shay. Dr. Shay serves as the faculty division chair of the government department at Houston Community College. She has presented her work on online teaching and learning at professional conferences, including the Midwest Political Science Association and the American Political Science Association's Teaching and Learning Conference. She earned her MA and PhD in political science from Rice University. Dr. Shay, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Last but not least, we are joined by Carrie Pritchett. Professor Pritchett is a history professor at Brazosport College. Her research specialization is in 20th century diplomatic and political history, with a particular interest in women in politics and voter rights. Carrie has been involved in political campaigns since high school, and she has worked and volunteered for many campaigns in Northeast Texas and the Houston area. Carrie, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We would have a fourth speaker joining us today from a Republican auxiliary club. Unfortunately, however, they had to cancel at the last minute. So I just want to say thank you again for everyone for joining us today and for participating. Before diving into our discussion questions, I want to highlight some political milestones in U.S. history for our audience. In 1917, Jeannette Rankin of Montana was the first woman elected to serve in the U.S. Congress. Elected as a Republican to the U.S. House of Representatives, Representative Rankin was a strong advocate for universal suffrage and peaceful resolutions. It's interesting to note that Representative Rankin opposed going to war in World War I and World War II, which she was the only member of Congress to vote against the declaration of war against Japan. In her swearing-in ceremony, Representative Rankin is quoted for asserting, quote, "I may be the first woman member of Congress, but I won't be the last." And she was right. Mm-hmm. In 1920, the 19th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution was ratified, which guarantees women the right to vote in the United States. The fight was difficult and drawn out. Suffragists and suffragettes lobbied, lectured, wrote letters to editors and other materials, and of course practiced in civil disobedience. While it took approximately 80 years to achieve victory, we celebrate their success today. As First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, she used her position to advance principles she held, which were centered on political, racial, and social justice. Serving as a strong voice in the White House, Eleanor Roosevelt encouraged her husband, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, to appoint more women to federal positions. Furthermore, her work in human rights was profound. Eleanor Roosevelt was a force, the force, that pushed the United Nations to adopt the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was formally adopted on December 10, 1948. In 1973, the Supreme Court landmark case Roe v. Wade was decided. This controversial decision made abortion legal across the United States. The Supreme Court determined that a woman's right to choose to have an abortion or not falls within the right to privacy protected by the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. It is noteworthy to observe the lack of women on the bench in this case, which brings us to 1981, where President Ronald Reagan appointed Sandra Day O'Connor to the US Supreme Court. Justice O'Connor was the first woman to be appointed to the Supreme Court. Sandra Day O'Connor had judicial and legislative experience, which was unique, being elected as a state senator of the Arizona legislature in the 1970s. During her confirmation hearing, Justice O'Connor asserted that, quote, judges are not only not authorized to engage in legislative or executive functions, but they are also ill-equipped to do so, being a strong voice on the court for judicial restraint. It is noteworthy to mention one more time here real quick, that on August 12th, 2009, President Barack Obama awarded Justice O'Connor with the nation's highest civilian honor, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And as of 2019, 50.8% of the US population is women, according to the US Census Bureau. And finally, we have a graphic illustration that shows the number of women in Congress, that is both in the House and Senate chambers, and the sessions of Congress. As time progresses, we see more women are elected to serve in the national legislature. As of the 116th Congress, a historic number of women were elected, with 127. So with that backdrop, let's begin with our discussion questions. So a 2008 study by Jennifer L. Lawless and Richard L. Fox revealed that women are less likely to consider running for public office. So my question for everyone is, what are some of the barriers and challenges that can explain why, and what can be done to address them?
Well, I'll go ahead and start. I think the biggest challenge is that women are just not encouraged to run. Most women will wait till somebody asks them to and nudges them and pushes them, and it's not enough. And when a woman looks at a position or an opening or a vacancy, and even after somebody says to them, well, you know, Carrie, you really should run for that seat, the first thing she's going to do is go like, well, I don't know if I'm qualified. You know, I don't have that experience. I'm not sure if I can, if it doesn't pay, if it's a position that doesn't pay. You know, I got to worry about, if they have children, they got to worry about the kids. I mean, there's so many other things that they go to a checklist to decide if they should even run. Whereas a lot of the male politicians, the minute something's open, they'll just say, I'm going to run, and they just go for it. And everybody just starts patting them on the back and saying that you need to run. The second thing that keeps a lot of women from running is the fundraising. It takes a lot of money to run for office. And we usually don't have the financial network or the process in place to help us raise money. And when you look at donors, the majority of donors are women, are men, and they tend to give to male candidates. That women do better with women donors. So a lot of the PACs are chaired by men, or the checks are written by men. So that's always an obstacle. And the last one is just, you know, we haven't seen enough women running so that young girls can see that, hey, this is an option. This is something I can do. So I think you've seen that. You saw your graph, it went up because as more young girls and little girls see that, yes, you can be president. Yes, you can run for vice president. You can run for vice president. Yes, you can run for governor. They start thinking about it. So it's taken a while for us to get there. So as a candidate, I can tell you that it's, you know, it's always challenging because people will remember more of what I wore today than what I said, because that's the difference in how they judge male candidates and women candidates. They'll criticize my hair, criticize the color blue I picked, but they may not remember any of the policy positions that I'll be discussing today. So I'd be interested to see what the professors have to say.
Well, I'll jump in and at least offer that the study is now 12 years old. And we have seen some changes, some very positive changes in the direction of women as self-starters, just bold, brash, diving in and figuring it out as they go, doing the old-fashioned kind of campaigning and fundraising, knocking on doors and greeting people where they are in their communities. And I think as we see, especially young women of color running for US House and Senate positions and young women in general, and winning, it helps build momentum behind running and staying in office. I think the criticism about money is real, but increasingly women's organizations are stepping up and raising money and finding ways to help candidates run their campaigns. And I think the parties could do a better outreach to bring young women in to the party structures, because party endorsement and party money can be very, very helpful. I do want to mention what I think is a very contemporary kind of barrier that's something women have to face, in particular because of the harshness directed at women in politics, but it's the trolls on the internet who attack women, attack their families, attack their children, make death threats, threats to destroy their property, destroy their lives, careers. They threaten sexual assault. That would take an enormously thick skin for a woman to take the risk of running for office today. And we see that behavior at the highest levels in the United States, that kind of trolling behavior.
Carrie, do you have any thoughts?
I did. I was muted and didn't realize it. Sorry. I did want to touch on the theme that that Congresswoman Garcia and Cammy talked about, was that the old saying of you can't be what you can't see. And if, you know, young women don't see other women in positions of political office, it is hard to find that goal to run and think that you can run for office. And luckily, we do have more and more women, and especially women of color, being elected to office, and at least federal office. I certainly would like to see more in the state, but we may be getting close to taking down that barrier a little bit, at least, that more women are becoming, are being elected, and young girls can see that and they're paying attention.
I think what the professor said earlier about the trolls is very, very real, because as someone who has trolls, and it's mostly on Twitter, I don't have anybody following me everywhere I go, but I have colleagues that the minute they step out of their offices, there is a tracker that's there with a cell phone, just filming everything from the moment they leave their office till we get into the Capitol. Or they just come over and ask you a question and try to catch you saying something stupid, or doing something out of the ordinary that they can then post on social media. And I think what happened this week with that militia group plotting to kidnap the governor of Michigan, I mean, why go after the woman? I mean, I guess they had a huge presence in Michigan, obviously, but it goes back to what was said earlier. I mean, it's women are targeted. There was a study last week on the targets of death or ill, or just this ugly, vile stuff that goes on because Twitter, or was it Facebook, took down some comments about President Trump. And someone called them out and said, wait a minute, why are you just removing stuff about him? You didn't remove him when they were saying things about Representative Omar or Representative Ocasio-Cortez or Nancy Pelosi. And they did a study, and sure enough, women are targeted more, and women of color are targeted more than any other group. So I think that's going to make some women think twice about running for office because of that fear, and especially if it's any danger or harm to their families and their children. I mean, that's when women just really, women are like a lion protecting their baby and their family. And if that happens a lot, I think it's going to keep some people from people are going to think twice about running.
Excellent observations. Thank you so much. If you all are ready, let's go to the second question. Women are often labeled as too emotional to govern. However, during his confirmation hearing in 2018, Brett Kavanaugh's behavior raised serious questions regarding his temperament. Is this an example of a double standard?
Should we just raise our hands that it is? I mean, there's no question in my mind that it is. And I can tell you that if a woman had displayed that same behavior, everybody would have said that she didn't have the temperament or the cool-headedness or the judgment to be on the Supreme Court. She would have just been dismissed and taken off the list. And I thought his behavior was horrid. And we'll have to wait and see how they treat the current nominee if a hearing is held as scheduled. I think they're scheduled to begin next week, to see what kind of questions they ask her and how they treat her. But yeah, there's always a double standard. I remember the first time I ran in 1992, that a group actually told me to my face that they could support me because as a judge, I had a more stern, stoic, serious look. And I thought, okay, and what about everybody else, all the other women running? Because this was in 92 when Emily Sliss, which is a major women's fundraising group, had just really begun, and I think it was their third year. And they held a session for all of us. And when somebody said that, I just thought, what does that really have to do with anything? I mean, they were more interested in, again, how you look and whether or not you present yourself serious. And they said, oh no, we love that picture of you in your robe. And I thought, well, okay. I mean, I've never really liked wearing the black robe because black was not my color. But apparently it made an impression on them. And I guess it worked because I got endorsed by that one group. But it was the first time that I had really faced, and someone was honest enough to say it to my face. Oh no, we like you. I think you'll be fine because you have that stern, stoic look. I went, not sure I like that, but if it works.
Well, I can offer that this old trope about women not being capable of doing men's work is dying out. It's losing traction. And fortunately, we've seen enough examples of women leaders at all levels of society, from the very local community levels all the way up the chain to heads of state around the world. And women have proven their leadership, not only in public service, but in the private sector as well. So hopefully that will begin to change these standards, and we will begin to see more thoughtful examination of questions that are important. Is temperament important? I do believe that it was Hillary Clinton that tried to make that a campaign issue in the last presidential election, raising the question of Donald Trump's temperament. And I think we've seen the kinds of concerns that she foreshadowed in his behavior, but it didn't really resonate strongly enough in electoral college states to make a difference. So is temperament itself measurable? Is there a standard, a kind of, here's our median level of temperament that we expect in candidates that run for public office? Or is it just this highly subjective assessment that can be framed by media sources or particular groups in a way that's either positive or negative? So I think we have to be careful and just encourage voters to do some work, to do some research, and find out information about the candidates that they support that will help them make a rational decision.
So this question, I think it goes beyond the political world, certainly. You know, as someone who at 18 was told by her grandfather that I was too opinionated, and instead of going to college, I should get married and have children and not go to college because I was already too opinionated as it was. I think this is just kind of something that is unfortunately ingrained, especially in, you know, rural East Texas where I grew up. But as far as temperament in a political candidate or a judge, I think the temperament, you know, they should be judged by their temperament, whether they're men or women. You know, what Kavanaugh did was reprehensible on the stand. And if, absolutely, if that were a woman, she would not have been approved or, you know, gotten through the committee. So I think it's important just to look at the temperament just overall. But I know that that's asking quite a bit sometimes, but so yeah.
It makes me wonder if there are any more double standards that potentially exist. Would anyone like to speak about that?
I think if you name it, there will be a double standard. And I think as women, we've lived with this standard, double standard, most of our lives in some form or fashion, whether it's growing up with an older brother, as in my case, where I had to assert the same privileges or opportunities that he was given that I was not. I think it's deeply ingrained. It's ingrained in our educational system, in the way that boys are often treated differently from girls, especially in certain kinds of classes. And we've got data on that. So I think if we're going to expect changes in the way in which individuals are judged for who they are and their accomplishments, we people out here in society need to say, this is the information that we want, and we don't want double standards. I think we need to no longer accept that that's a normal way of conducting business in the private sector or the public.
And I think it really is based on sexism. I mean, and sexism exists just like racism exists. And if you look at the comments that the president made about Kamala Harris calling her a monster, I mean, would he have called a male vice presidential candidate a monster? Probably not. But he thinks he can get away with that because she's a woman and she's an African American woman, or a woman of color. So I think that a lot of this is again back to what the professor said earlier, of women being targets. People see women more vulnerable, and especially some men who have never, they believe the study, not the one that you showed us that was in the 1980s, but they prefer the studies from 1950s that say that women should stay at home, or have listened to Carrie's grandfather. And Carrie, in South Texas, they told me the same thing. So no worries. It's part of growing up in rural South Texas.
I think so. Yeah.
It's we're getting better. People are better conditioned. There's better images of women. We're doing more things. And it will eventually change. I remember when I first got involved with the women's movement back in college, and there was a button that talked about 50-50 by 2010, by 2000. I mean, the goal was to have 50% of the people in Congress to be women. And the goal was in 2000. Here we are, it's 2020, and we still don't have 50%. So, every year we move the goalpost, but we're going to get there. And I think the glass ceilings that have been broken will continue to break, and more women will be not only in members of Congress, but as CEOs and in boardrooms and business owners and chief of surgeries at hospitals. I mean, I think we're already seeing that in the legal profession with more than 50% of the classes are women, and we're seeing more women judges. So I think it's happening. It's not quite there yet, and there's still some people that are holding on to their old ways. But time will come and things will change.
Thank you. Let's move on then to our thought question. With the passing of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, President Trump promises to fill the vacant Supreme Court seat with a woman, which he has now named. Have we made progress, or is this an attempt to pander to women voters during an election year?
I definitely think it is pandering to women voters. If you look at 2008 with John McCain's vice presidential nominee, Sarah Palin, on paper, doesn't matter if she was male or female, she was not really qualified for that position, yet this was I remember when she was picked, I thought, wow, McCain is trying to get especially the white women voters who may have still been upset that Hillary Clinton didn't get the nomination. So, I mean, it looks like this is happening over again. Although I will say that that Judge Barrett's record is very conservative, and it does align with his platform. So there's definitely that. I think any judge he would have picked would have been very conservative. So, but I still think that yes, it is a pandering to women voters.
And I think there's some pandering too to the evangelical vote, because this is something that the evangelical voters really, really want it done, and they want it done now. And that's causing the process to be just slammed through because they don't want to risk having to wait and the president not winning or they not having the majority in the Senate for approval. So I think there's a lot of pandering to evangelical voters with this nominee because she fits their profile, although she's not evangelical, she's Catholic, but she's a very conservative Catholic. I'm Catholic too, but I don't consider myself a conservative. I'm a social justice Catholic. So I think that there was, you know, that's a real strong base for him, the evangelical vote. So he's got to produce. And remember, he's stepping away from the relief package talks because he told the senators that they've got a nominee and they got to focus on that. They can't focus anymore on coming to terms in a relief package. So he's putting a nomination for Supreme Court above the lives of the people that are still suffering and hurting from the pandemic. And we'll see what happens next week because there's a lot of public pressure to go back to the negotiating table on that relief package, but he's got to focus on those voters and the election. He's got a lot on his plate.
And I really like the example that we've got right now, this heightened coverage of the Supreme Court and the nomination process and all of this, I think is actually really important for most Americans who don't know a lot about it. Although with the Merrick Garland issue back some years ago, we should be aware of this. The president's power to appoint federal judges is strong, and it's one of the strongest powers invested in the president of the United States. So everything about judicial nominations is political. The court itself all the courts are political to some extent. So I do concur completely with both Representative Garcia and with Carrie that he's signaling to women, and he's signaling to the white evangelicals who make up his base at a time when most Americans are deeply concerned about how the pandemic has affected their lives. Is it pandering? It's political. He's paying political debts and setting political signals with this nomination. Do I think something good can come out of it when she is confirmed? Because as they're working it, she will be confirmed. It's another one of those examples where we've got conservative women in the US and we have liberal women in the US, and to see more women on the court, I think ultimately can be a good thing. But the politics of this process right now are so thick and so deep that I do hope people are paying attention despite all the weight of the pandemic on their lives, because it is consequential.
Excellent observations as well. If everyone's ready, let's continue on with our fourth discussion question. Former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt played a monumental role in the passage of the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Despite the declaration, nation states, though, continue to commit gross human rights violations, notably North Korea, China, and Syria. What are some of the barriers preventing human rights from being respected? And has the United States been a champion of human rights?
Well, I think our country has always been a champion and a leader in the area of human rights. However, this last 2 or 3 years with this president, things have been changing. He seems to be enamored with dictators and leaders who are the cause of some of the issues related to human rights. And he doesn't really want to be a part of the bodies that we work with, traditionally have worked with globally to ensure human rights. And I can tell you that there are human rights violations in our very own country that are incredibly horrible, that we would expect to be happening in other countries and not here. You know, it started with the separation and tearing of children out of their mother's arms at the border, and what he's doing with refugees, what he's doing against a lot of people coming into our country. And I personally visited a detention center in Georgia. You all may have read about it this 2 weekends ago. And what I saw there was probably the most horrific violations of human rights that I've ever seen. Women being subjected to surgeries, including hysterectomies, without their consent, fallopian tubes being removed. There's a woman who still to today doesn't know what surgery they did on her. And, you know, those things just don't happen in this country. It's stuff that we see and think about happening in other countries. So I think that we're at a crossroads, if you will, in terms of our leadership on this issue. And if the change doesn't happen that we expect, or some of us would want and expect this November, I think that we could get into a position where we're going to lose our leadership role, and we're going to be, not as well respected by the global community.
I concur completely. I think we've lost whatever kind of moral authority we've grown accustomed to asserting over human rights issues, especially over the last 3 years. And adding to the horrific separation of children from their parents and families at the border and caging of children. We've also got, this bright light shining on systemic racism in policing and the criminal justice system. Mass incarceration has been unmasked for what it really has been. And the rest of the world knows this. They're watching, they have access to information. And for people around the world, this is important. It's important for them to understand that we still struggle in this country with assuring the promises of the founding documents, for assuring the promises under our laws and how we treat one another. We are still struggling with how to actualize those promises. And human rights, I think, serve as such a robust platform to talk about how human beings treat one another, which is really what government addresses. Government, in effect, answers the big question of how do we want to live together, at least in a representative system where we have some choice over that, we have some agency over that. And I share the concern that I believe I heard in Representative Garcia's voice that this is not the country that we claim to be, that others believe us to be around the world. And this reckoning is important for us so that we can get back on, I think, a path that pursues human rights here and around the world and does so authentically and honestly. But so long as countries assert national sovereignty, so long as deeply entrenched social and power hierarchies exist, they're going to claim that human rights extensions are a threat. So it's a fascinating area. It's an important area.
I concur with Representative Garcia and Cammy. It's hard to be the example that we have longed to be. I don't know if we've ever actually been there as perfect examples of human rights, but we have lost a lot of credibility over the past 2 or 3 years. And so to tell dictatorships like North Korea, China, and Syria, others, that they should clean up their act, we are in no position to do that right now. And, as Representative Garcia said, we aren't a part of those main bodies anymore that would police that. And so we have definitely taken a hit, and I hope one day we can get that back. I really do. Another comment, especially about women in human rights advocacy, you've pointed out with Eleanor Roosevelt being greatly involved in that after World War II. If you look at world movements in human rights, many of them are led by women. And so possibly the more women we have in positions of power in the United States, that could help us get back to where we need to be.
I'd kind of like to add on to that, because here, even within our own communities, women are often the leaders. Women are often the organizers around things that are human rights, like access to water, Flint, Michigan, access to health care, access to clean air. A lot of the citizens groups that emerge to help protect communities are women-led. In the Black community, African-American women have been leaders throughout time in organizing communities for what we can call human rights work. So yes, I agree completely. Women have been at the heart of human rights work forever, elevating the concerns of communities, and I hope that more women will enter the area regardless of the results next month in our own elections.
Excellent observations. This also, it's already been mentioned, but this ties in with our fifth question here. And that is, in the summer of 2018, the Trump administration announced its zero tolerance policy. While the policy was intended to deter illegal crossings at the border, the result has been separation of families. Is the United States drifting away from respecting human rights? If so, what can be done?
Well, we got to fight back like hell. That's all I can tell you, because it is, this week, it was reported that the Attorney General at the time, Jeff Sessions, actually told his assistant U.S. attorneys and people around him, we need to separate the children. And I think then someone even said, and it doesn't matter how young they are. They had been denying that there was any of this, that it just kind of happened. So it's like, when you think about, the Attorney General of the United States being behind this, it just even more distressing, because that person should be the one to make sure that our laws are not violated and that we have a strong enforcement of things to respect human rights and legal rights. But unfortunately, that's not the case, and I think it is drifting away. And I think it's just another example of how wrong things are right now. And we're going to have to, as a nation, look at ourselves in the mirror and say, what kind of country do we really want to be? Do we want to be respected? Do we want to believe in human rights and the basic values of decency and respect for the individual, treating people with dignity? Because that's who I think we are. But regrettably, there are some people in government, in high-ranking positions, and in policy positions that don't agree, and they just want to do what they want to do to get through their agenda. So I think it's time for this really is a fight for the soul of our nation and where we're going as a nation, and I think that we're going to have to really focus on not only bringing the country together in terms of the violence and the domestic terrorism in our own geography, but also in terms of our role globally. Because I think there's still a lot of countries right now, I'm hearing they're just laughing at all this. I mean, when you think of our country having more COVID cases, and I forget what number, it's 4 or 5 other countries combined. I mean, it's just they cannot believe that we're not handling all this, because they thought that we're the ones that have the the resources and the capacity and the intellectual knowledge to handle this. So I think we have a lot of soul searching to make. We have a lot of mirror tests to go through, and we're going to have to roll up our sleeves and fix it all.
I agree. And as the granddaughter of an undocumented immigrant who made his way here and lived a good life, a short life, but a good life, but gave me my mother. I think we need to collectively reflect on our roots, who we are, where we've come from, and take a look at the polls. We're observing a Congress that is moving so far away from where public opinion polls, good ones, reputable ones, tell us the people are. You know, most Americans favor legislation that would create a pathway to citizenship for undocumented individuals in this country. And there are conditions and all kinds of things to make sure that we're going to create that pathway for people who are here to pursue what generations of immigrants came here to pursue. It's who we are as a country. I think what COVID has done is show us the complete failure of government, especially at the federal and state levels, where we've seen local governments really trying to take strong positions and keep people safe in this public health emergency, and they've been thwarted by political leaders above them. What we've seen laid bare to us is our fragile grasp of human rights. We don't have access to health care that's equitable. We still have uninsured Americans. You know, COVID testing is not free to everybody, though it was promised that it would be. It's laid bare our lack of investments in basic human infrastructure, including education. So we have this opportunity to really look at who we are, but then press who we are to the elected officials. There are political scientists who for years have been looking at this gap between the action of elected officials and where the public is in terms of policy preferences. And I just don't think that's sustainable. We can't call ourselves a representative democracy if legislation continues to be passed that's completely out of sync with policy preferences. And I think, you know, we'll see what the elections produce. We'll see whether we can govern effectively as this public health crisis lingers. The status quo is unacceptable. It's unacceptable.
So to add on to that, well, first I want to say that my relatives in the Netherlands contact me just about once a week, twice a week sometimes, to remind me that we are the laughingstock of especially Western Europe now, if not the world. So I'm, very aware of what the world is saying, and I am, appalled by it. This is not the country that I grew up believing in. It's not the country I grew up in, definitely. But as far as respecting human rights, I think that education also will play a very important part in this. If you can educate people from a young age of, what human rights are, and, not really, educating as far as, the moral compass, but maybe a human compass of, this is not right, this is not acceptable, and putting the information out there. I think that could go a long way to possibly making this right one day, because we can't keep the status quo of today.
I just, this week, Texas made the bottom of the scale. We're number 50 in the uninsured rate. I mean, that is not anything to brag about. And we like to brag about a lot of stuff in Texas. I mean, we should just be ashamed of ourselves. And this governor's opposition to expanding Medicaid doesn't help the situation any better. Because when you look at the disparities with COVID positives and the hospitalizations and the deaths, Latinos are dying at a very high disproportionate number. I think we were like 54, almost 55% of the deaths in Texas, although we're what, 42% of the population. And a lot of that is because of historical disparities with lack of access to healthcare. And if we don't have an insurance program like the Affordable Care Act that people can enroll in getting an exchange or Medicaid coverage, then you don't take care of people. It's like Professor Shay said, there's no investment in the human capital. And until you do that, it's going to keep doing and doing. And the one that completely baffles me, and I'm not getting a satisfactory answer of children, is about the positive rate in COVID with children, infants. Even in infants, Latino infants and Latino children under age 18 are disproportionately higher. You know, I can see the adult because we've developed the hypertension, some of us are obese, we've got the diabetes, the risk factors. But the little bitty babies aren't there yet. I mean, I don't know what it is. And I tell you, I've asked, I didn't get to ask Dr. Fauci the question because I had to leave to another meeting, but I left the question to be asked. I mean, I don't get it. I mean, what is it that even with infants and children, I think we're hospitalized, our children are hospitalized like 10 times more than white children. That's pretty astounding. So this state needs to invest more in human capital and human needs.
Thank you so much. Let's move on now to our sixth question. And our sixth question is, while every vote is important, women make up approximately 50.8% of the US population. Have the two major political parties and candidates made an effective case to women? And what impact do you believe women will have on the upcoming election in November?
I'm going to let the professors go first this time.
Well, I'm happy to jump in on that one. I think just generally, we should talk about the gender gap that exists, that women for many, many election cycles have favored Democratic Party candidates over Republican Party candidates. So there's this gap that the Republican Party has tried to address. And they made significant gains in 2016, appealing to white suburban women. And they were remarkably successful in that, as about 53% of white suburban women voted for Donald Trump. For the Republicans going into next month's election, the question is, how do they retain that level of support? And the polls are showing us, again, reputable polls, that they've lost a lot of it. That the actions of the president, the actions of the administration, the inaction of the president and the administration, the lack of national policy with regard to the pandemic have had a deleterious effect on white suburban female support for Trump, and potentially down the ballot, which could put Texas in play. I think that's why the Biden campaign is investing resources here. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of buzz that this election could turn Texas. So the Republicans have a problem there. The Democrats, they need to bring more people in to the electorate, into voting, into the voting process. So making direct appeals to women is important. And I think the Democrats understand that, and they've been doing it, and they've got strong female incumbents that can continue to talk to women about the importance of their involvement in elections. So I think the challenge for Democrats is bringing in new voters. The most solid voting bloc in the Democratic Party is African-American women. So more outreach to Latinas, more outreach to Asian American women, and more outreach to white women directly in recognition that the policy failures of this administration weigh heavily on women and their families. So can the Democrats increase their turnout going into the election? It's tough. Kamala Harris's nomination is important, very important, symbolically, to the African-American women who are a strong backbone of the Democratic Party, to Indian American women, with a lot of immigrants from India who have become citizens and are active and will vote. Her nomination is not only historic, but it's designed to represent, to showcase this broad coalition that makes up the Democratic Party. It's much more heterogeneous than the Republican Party. So I think there are some challenges that both parties face. I don't believe that the vice president's performance the other night in the debate, the pseudo debate against Kamala Harris, helped the Republicans at all. And I think we're already seeing some polling data to suggest that his behavior has turned off a number of women who watch that engagement.
I think that, I definitely agree with Cammy. The key to this election is getting not only women to the polls, which I think women in general do vote more than men on the polls I've read, but it's getting the women of color to the polls. And in the Republican platform and the Republican advertising, I don't see anything in their ads that would get women to the polls. I don't see anything in the debates that would get women to the polls to vote Republican. And I think with the Democrats, you could always do a better job, but I think they are doing a fairly good job of trying to appeal to women, and especially women of color. And as far as, as women's health care, for example, the Democrats definitely have that to campaign on, and that is going to, I think, get more women to vote and voting on the Democratic ticket.
Well, I certainly agree with what's been said, and I think I'm very biased, of course, because I am a Democrat. But I think if you, healthcare is what's on people's concern. It's the virus. It's about whether or not they can get a test whenever they need it. It is whether or not they think that they're going to be able to get a vaccine, or are they going to have, they can't get a test. Well, then how in the heck are they going to get the vaccine? Who's going to be in line first? Because again, we've seen the disparities with just access to health care. So unless, the Democrats, of course, our platform says that there will be testing and tracing and treatment for everyone at no cost, that it'll be part of the healthcare plan. And the biggest fight is just protecting pre-existing conditions and making sure that people can have their children on their insurance till they're 25, because those are two that are already, on the chopping block in the Supreme Court in a case that the administration has filed. So there's a lot of concern about what's going to happen to people's health care, not only immediately with COVID, but long term. So that's on the ballot. And we have passed over 600 bills, and at least 150 of them are bipartisan. It wasn't just Democrats voting on them. And it really goes to, extending the deadline for the Equal Rights Amendment so we can finally have that in part of the Constitution. It's equal pay for equal work. It's the Violence Against Women Act extended. I mean, it's about the minimum wage at $15. I mean, that helps women more than any other group because women are the ones who do those minimum wage jobs, especially women who are divorced or that lose their husband, and then they automatically become the head of household and have to worry about taking care of a family. So they, and then we also have a bill on some pension reform so that there'll be more money that can be put in pensions so that, again, there's an inequity there. Men get higher pensions than we do. So I mean, there's a lot that we have done, but regrettably, they're all sitting on McConnell's desk collecting dust. So that's why we need to make the change that matters, not only in the White House, but in the Senate also, to make sure that we can make all these bills become law. And let me tell you, I served on the Democratic Platform Drafting Committee, and it starts there when you put together what every Democrat runs on. And there was probably more men than women on that drafting committee because they made sure that we had a voice and a seat at the table. The Republican Party didn't even put a platform together this year. They decided that, they were going to run on their record and they didn't need a platform. So someone else is dictating what's happening in the Republican Party, and I think we all know who. So I think that's a big difference too, is the commitment from the beginning, from the parties, because it starts with the platform, and then it builds from there. So I'm really confident that more women are going to see what the Democratic Party has done for women. And I think we're going to see women, even moderate and even conservative women who, frankly, some of them are just embarrassed by some of the actions that are occurring this last 2 or 3 years and the last 2 or 3 weeks. And I think we're going to see more women voting Democrat this year.
Thank you. Now let's move on to our 7th and final question. Historically, the United States has stood as a beacon of democracy in the international system. What example do we set for the world regarding women in politics? Carrie, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I'll go first. I think that, we're, as we've said before, we're definitely making strides toward having women more involved in politics, and we're increasing the numbers of women. But if you look at other countries, they are quite ahead of us in female prime ministers and presidents. So we do have a way to go, and I think the example we're setting currently is not a good one, but there's definitely room to grow there. And I have a feeling that we're playing catch up to many other countries as far as women in politics. That we can do better than we have.
Yeah, and I'd kind of like to contextualize this a little bit differently from how it's sort of standard approach to, U.S. as a beacon of democracy. we really are a very young country, although we take our origin story back centuries. In terms of our representative democracy, we really only achieved technical universal suffrage in the 1970s with the extension of the Voting Rights Act to Texas and to other states, to incorporate language minority groups to have access to the ballot in a form that was meaningful. Before that, the great extension of rights in the 1960s. But, you know, I can date my birth back to the 1950s, and this is all in my lived experience. We're a young democracy, despite the length of our Constitution. And we are still struggling. We are still grappling with demographic changes that have been underway across my lifetime and that are really coming clear, as in women in the workforce. You know, my mother, bless her heart, was really delighted when her 4 children entered elementary school so she could get back to the workforce. And there are a lot of us who believe that we can raise our families while working in careers that are meaningful or jobs that are necessary. And that portended one of the biggest shifts for women in this country across all groups. And we're still living with the implications of this shift. And I think as more women work, and we see the necessity of work, we see the satisfaction in work or the challenges in work, it brings us closer to politics and how politics matter. And how politics are relevant, and that's all good things. And we see young women coming into politics. We see women of color in politics now talking about the power of government that can be used in ways that are beneficial socially. And if there are social benefits, there are economic benefits. If we raise people out of poverty, we have more consumers in our economy. We have more taxpayers generating revenue. It's a healthy thing. So I think if we recognize that we're still a country that's maturing, maybe we're not the beacon, but maybe we're the hope of democracy in the world. And I believe fervently that women will play a greater role over time. I've got 2 adult daughters, one of whom is a political scientist studying gender in politics, because she understands how important this area is, though the country of her expertise is India. My youngest, Carrie, lives in Amsterdam, so I do get those regular updates as well about how we are perceived, and our shortcomings are so very evident in healthcare and food access and in our justice system and so many other things that we need to reckon with. This is a reckoning. We've got more demographic changes coming. America is going to become even more pluralistic. By 2045, there will be no majority population in the United States. And I hope we will grow in the next 20, 25 years as we reach that plateau and deepen our understanding of what it means to be an American, what it means, what this idea of America really means, and how we choose to live together. I think women will be leading voices through these changes because they do involve critical questions about how we treat one another domestically. And I think women have very strong and clear positions in those areas.
Well, I certainly agree that we need to focus on hope, and I do hope that women take a seat at the table and be part of the conversation at every level of government, from school board all the way to the White House. A lot of glass ceilings have been broken, but quite frankly, not enough. If you mentioned our first member of Congress Congresswoman from Montana, you mentioned our first Supreme Court justice, but we still haven't had a vice president or a president. We've had nominees and we've broken those two ceilings, but we need to go further because I think Carrie's right. I mean, so many other countries are so way ahead of us in terms of leadership at the highest levels of government and in the cabinet positions in these governments. So we've got a lot of work to do. And I call democracy a gift. It's a gift that one generation gives to the other. And right now, it's a little shaky. We've got to make sure that we protect the integrity of our elections. We got to make sure that we protect the security of our nation. And we got to make sure that we protect the democracy that we have so that we can gift it to the next generation. Because if we don't do that, then our whole world will change and our role in this world will change. Again, it's taking that look in the mirror and deciding who we want to be. And I'm for a democracy. There's no way I'm ever going to be for a dictatorship or any other kind of form of government for this country. But if we don't watch out, we get to too much unrest and civil division, we may end up in that kind of hurdle. So this is a very pivotal time for all of us to search our souls and decide what we want to do. And to me, it's about protecting that gift of democracy so that I can pass it on to the next generation and that our children can be able to grow and think freely and be whoever it is that they see and go to the fullest potential. So thank you again for doing this for us today.
Thank you. So as we wrap this up, I want to offer an opportunity for any final or last comments that any of you have regarding women in politics.
I say just go for it. If you're thinking of running, Carrie, you need to run. Dr. Shay, you need to run. Let me be the first one to ask you to run. It could be the school board, it could be, something there at the college. But we need to make sure that more women are at the table everywhere and that we're part of the conversation and that we're part of getting things done. Because I'm convinced it'll be more collegial. It'll be more where our work will be more conscientious and it'll be more peaceful. I think women tend to be more collaborators. So I think it would be for the good of the country. And it's like Nancy Pelosi always says, when women succeed, America succeeds. So thank you again.
I think my last comments on this are, it's something that I do think about now that I have nieces. And when you talk about the generations and protecting democracy for the future generations, it applies to women's rights as well. And I don't want my nieces to have less rights than I do right now. And I think one of the ways to ensure that my nieces have a better, life as a woman than I did, which is the idea that the next generation will be better, is to elect more women into office to offer that protection for women's rights, for human rights. And so I think it is critical that if we want to continue the rights that we have, that our mothers and grandmothers worked for, that it's important to keep more women in office. And thank you for putting this together. I really appreciate that.
I'd just like to add that I think there's so much room for allies in these movements that are underway, and that we do recognize that there are feminist men who are allies. I have a son and a son-in-law who are both feminists and will harness their energy in support of their wives, my daughter and daughter-in-law, and women in their workplace. Because we've learned through our experiences in working together that diversity really does produce better results. So we need more women. We need more women of color in leadership positions. And we need more experiences of working with men, which is fraught in this highly polarized environment. We need to find our allies, and we need to work in meaningful ways to protect what we value. And Representative Garcia, I appreciate your comments so much about the precarity of our democracy. I'm a Latin Americanist by training. My doctoral work was about the Mexican Revolution, but my graduate studies were centered in authoritarianism in Latin America, including coup d'etat and military dictatorships. There are a lot of political scientists, professional researchers in the field who are raising warnings, critical warnings about the health of our political system. And I think we all need to take a deep breath, recognize what we value, and work as allies across all kinds of different groups to protect institutions that we value in the face of really serious challenges. And thank you also for inviting me to this event.
But panel, I just want to say again, thank you so much. I appreciate you all being here and discussing these topics. I just want to say for the audience, early voting begins today. So if you are registered to vote, I encourage you, regardless if you're Democrat or Republican, regardless where you stand on issues, it's vital. Political participation is critical to the system that we have. So I encourage everyone to please go out and vote, participate in this upcoming election. Also, I just want to say that the last day to vote is in fact November 3rd. This will be done in person. So I highly recommend, again, make a plan and participate. Participation is key. And finally, I just want to say one more time, panel, thank you so much. Dr. Shay, Representative Garcia, and Professor Pritchett, thank you so very much for being here today. And thank you so much for your insight.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Nice to meet you all. Hope to see
Nice to
you
meet you.
sometime in person. Y'all keep up the good work.
Thank you.
You too.